He pressed against me inside the narrow sleeping bag with a cautious certainty that stole the air from my lungs, the nylon whispering as our chests aligned, and his thigh slid between mine like it had always belonged there. Outside the canvas, our friends laughed at some late joke around the dying fire, their voices close enough to feel dangerous, yet somehow that closeness only pulled us tighter. He said my name in a rough whisper that carried the same careful heat I had tried to ignore all day. And when his hand found my wrist in the dark and rested there, not grabbing but claiming, I knew the cold was the excuse we had needed, and not the reason we were finally letting go. The tent smelled like damp pine and wood smoke and the faint citrus from his soap, and as the wind lifted and dropped the rainfly with quiet, steady breaths, I understood that the line we had respected for years was already bending beneath the weight of tonight. If I had been braver, I might have said something bold right then, yet I stayed still and listened to the wild rush of my own heartbeat, because sometimes silence is the truest way to answer a question you have both asked without words. We had known each other since the kind of years you mark by apartments and jobs, not semesters or hometown seasons. Two men who discovered almost by accident that they kept finding the same songs good and the same nights lonely. And we built a friendship out of errands, weekend coffee, and 100 small rescues that never needed repayment. Our group camped together every fall when the crowds thinned and the air sharpened, and this year the mountain lake looked like a piece of hammered steel under clouds that threatened rain, which only made the forest smell richer and the trail feel like a secret we were allowed to keep. By the time we reached the site, my shoulders had that pleasant ache that means you have carried something that mattered, and he walked beside me without talking too much, passing me the water bottle when he noticed I was saving my last sip like a bad habit, which he had teased me about more times than I could count. We pitched the tents in a lazy row beneath a stand of firs, the ground springy with needles and last year's leaves, and when the splitting into pairs part arrived like it always did, he lifted a brow and asked if my snoring had improved since last fall, which was his way of saying he hoped I still wanted to share. It was never the obvious things that made me notice him. It was the steady way he built a fire without lighting it twice, the gentle manner he used to loosen a stubborn zipper, the way his jokes arrived slow and dry so you had to lean closer to catch the warmth, and it was also the way my breathing changed whenever his shoulder touched mine in the cramped mess of a car or on a crowded bar bench. We ate late because the hike ran long, and the foil packets came off the coals with soft hisses that made everyone hungry at once. And when he passed me the first plate, he kept his fingers on the rim a second longer than necessary, like he wanted the heat to travel from the food to the tin to his skin to mine. I told myself it was the cold in the forecast and the promise of frost on the tent roof, but the truth lived lower and fiercer, because I had felt his attention like a steady hand on my back all afternoon, and I knew he had felt mine even when we took turns pretending not to notice. Our friends argued cheerfully about constellations until someone got it right by accident, and the sky opened with a few early stars that looked like nailheads hammered into dark wood, while beside me he leaned back on his palms and let his knee drift into mine, a move so quiet it read like confession. Hey, if you're here and feeling the vibe already, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe to support these stories and help more people find them. It means the world, and it keeps us going. Thanks for being here. When the lake wind swung colder and the jokes thinned into easy yawns, we put out the fire with the last of the kettle water and watched the steam lift like ghosts from wet stones, and I tried to tell myself we would lie down like always and sleep like men who never crossed a line, yet I could not stop counting the inches between our shelters and the thin fabric that would separate our breath from everyone else's night. Inside the tent, the air was a little warmer and smelled like gear that had worked hard, and he tossed me a knit cap with a grin that said he remembered how I always forgot, which felt unfair and perfect in the same breath. He unzipped the sleeping bag to spread it like a quilt, then tugged me down by the cuff of my sleeve, a gesture so familiar that it disguised the tremor beneath it. And when we settled shoulder to shoulder, I could hear the muffled scrape of forks in someone else's cook kit, proof that the camp was not asleep yet, and we were not truly alone. The temperature dropped with a quiet determination that felt almost staged, and when our shared warmth failed to catch, he shifted closer until our hips touched, then closer still until our legs aligned in a way that could be defended as practical, though we both understood it was nothing of the sort. I told him my toes were useless blocks of ice, which was true enough, and he laughed into my hair and called me dramatic, then slid his foot along mine with a slow, careful pressure that felt like the answer to a question I had been asking the night for years. Outside, someone told a last story about a wrong turn that had become a good memory, and the punchline landed with a chorus of soft groans, while inside our narrow world his hand found the zipper pull and drew it up until the sleeping bag hugged us like a promise. He did not rush, because he never did, and the deliberate pace made everything sharper, the nylon crackling a little, as if our breath were static, while his mouth hovered near my ear, and the heat of it turned the air into something I could taste. "Tell me if you want space," he whispered, giving me the open door that brave men offer when they are also afraid. And I said his name with a steadiness I did not entirely own, then moved backward a fraction until my spine found his chest and stayed there. He pressed against me like a tide that had studied the shore before it arrived, his palm smoothing over my forearm in a slow stroke that could have been warmth and could have been worship, and the world beyond the tent skin faded until only the rhythm of our breath and the distant click of cooling stones mattered. The sleeping bag held us in a tight, gentle hold, our knees tucking together and our ankles tangling in a way that felt both clumsy and inevitable. And when his lips touched the place where my jaw meets my neck, the careful control I had worn all day loosened like a knot that finally understood how to open. We did not speak for a long, electric moment, because words would have made it real too fast, and because whatever came next deserved the kind of silence that makes room for yes. Somewhere near the fire ring, a friend coughed, then zipped a tent with the swift pull that ends a night, and the sound ran through me like a spark. Because secrecy was not the point, yet the nearness of discovery made every inch of skin feel brighter. He kissed me there in the dark with patience built from loyalty and wanting, all slow brush and careful pressure, and his fingers laced through mine inside the sleeping bag like he was finishing a pattern that had been started years ago, then put away for an evening that finally knew its name. I turned to face him in the narrow space, our noses bumping and our teeth knocking once because we were laughing without sound. And then we found each other properly, mouth to mouth, warm to warm, a patient, deep kiss that told the truth better than any speech either of us could have given by day. When we parted, I could taste wood smoke and winter and something that felt like relief, and he rested his forehead against mine until our breath calmed, his thumb stroking the inside of my wrist with a tenderness that made promises without trapping them. He whispered that we could stop if I needed, or sleep folded like this until morning, or keep going slowly until the cold forgot our names. And I told him I wanted all of those choices, in order, which made him smile against my mouth like a man who had finally come home. The cold had found its way in, threading through the zipper teeth and settling across our shoulders, Yet it didn't matter. The warmth pooling between us was the kind that burned slow and bright, the kind you don't walk away from, just because the night air has its own ideas. He shifted behind me, his forearm pressing along my side, and I could feel the subtle flex of muscle as he adjusted our shared pillow, which was really just a folded sweatshirt that smelled faintly of him. "You're shivering," he murmured, his breath brushing the back of my neck in a way that made me wonder if the words were just an excuse to be that close. Outside, the low voices of our friends carried from the campfire, telling half-finished stories and laughing in those quiet bursts that mean the night is winding down. I pictured them out there, mugs in hand, completely unaware that only a few steps away the air in our tent was charged enough to hum. A stray gust rattled the rainfly and the light from the fire stretched across the tent wall in shifting shadows. And for a second, it felt like we were underwater, hidden but surrounded. He slid his hand lower, fingers finding the curve of my hip through the thin layer of my base layer pants. And though the touch could have been nothing more than a friend adjusting space in a cramped sleeping bag, the slow exhale that followed gave it away. I caught his hand with mine, not to stop him, but to keep it there, a wordless agreement that maybe tonight we didn't have to pretend our years of careful friendship hadn't been quietly tilting toward this. From somewhere beyond our thin nylon wall, a tent zipper rasped open, followed by the muffled thump of boots on pine needles. An instinct made us both still. We listened not just to the sound outside, but to the sudden awareness of how close we were to being found like this. The footsteps passed, fading toward the lake, and when the silence returned, it felt sharper, heavier, and more deliberate. "I've thought about this before," he whispered, almost too low to hear, and I didn't need to ask what this meant the way our bodies fit here. The electricity in the inches of space we'd never crossed until tonight. I turned my head slightly, enough to catch the edge of his face in the dim light. And before I could say anything, the sound of laughter rolled closer from the fire pit, reminding me our friends were still right there. And then, with the firelight flickering against his eyes, he said something I wasn't ready for, something that made my pulse slam so hard I almost missed the last of his sentence. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, the shadow of someone moving past the tent wall broke the moment in half. The shadow outside passed, leaving only the hum of night, but the weight of his words stayed pressed against my skin like a second heartbeat. "You didn't hear me, did you?" he whispered again, and this time I caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I had heard him. I've wanted this since the first trip we ever took together, every syllable dropping into me like stones into deep water. The problem wasn't hearing it. The problem was the flood of heat that followed, the realization that I'd been carrying my own version of that confession for just as long. I turned in the narrow sleeping bag until we were face to face, knees bumping, noses almost brushing. His jaw was tense, like he was bracing for rejection, and something in me wanted to erase that tension completely. So I told him the truth that I'd wanted it too, but I'd been afraid of ruining what we had, afraid of crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His breath eased out, warm against my cheek, and his hand slid from my ribs to my chest until his palm was directly over my heartbeat, holding it as though he could keep it steady by sheer will. A sudden burst of laughter from outside broke the quiet, making both of us glance toward the tent wall. The voices were close mugs clinking, a log shifting in the fire pit, and the reminder that our friends were only a few steps away didn't kill the moment. It sharpened it. I could see it in his smile, small and crooked, like the risk was making everything taste better. The fire outside popped again, sending shadows flickering across the nylon above us, and for a second I imagined what we must look like from out there, two men tucked so close together in the dark, pretending to fight the cold. He dipped his head slightly, searching my face, and I realized we were seconds away from a decision we'd been circling for years. "I don't care if we ruin it," he murmured, his voice low enough to get lost in the wind. "I just care if we never try." The words landed in my chest like an anchor and a lifeline at the same time, and before I could second guess it, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't rushed, it was a test, a slow press of lips that deepened when I didn't pull back, when my hand found the back of his neck and held him there. The air between us grew warmer, thicker, and then a tent zipper rasped open nearby, loud in the quiet. A flashlight beam cut across the outside wall, pausing just long enough to send a sharp jolt through both of us. We froze, foreheads touching, breathing in unison, waiting to hear whether the footsteps would pass or stop right at our door. The flashlight beam lingered on the wall for just a second too long, sending a sharp pulse through my chest that made me aware of every place his body touched mine. Neither of us moved, our breaths sinking, as the slow crunch of boots on pine needles stopped just outside the tent flap. Through the thin nylon, a shadow leaned closer, the silhouette warped by the curve of the fabric, and in that suspended moment it was impossible to tell if they could hear the pounding of my heart. A voice broke the stillness, low, familiar, and far too close. "You guys awake?" It was Mark, one of the guys from our group, the kind who never quite knew when to call it a night. I felt his hand tighten on my side, not in panic, but in a silent plea for me not to move, not to answer. I stayed quiet, hoping the darkness and our stillness would convince him we were asleep. After a beat that stretched far too long, the shadow shifted, and I heard him mutter something about needing another log for the fire before his footsteps retreated toward the glow outside. The beam disappeared, and the tent sagged back into its natural shape. The only light now, the soft orange flicker seeping in from the fire a few yards away. He let out a slow breath against my neck, his hand still on me, his thumb brushing back and forth in a small, steady motion that felt more intimate than the kiss we'd just shared. "You didn't answer me," he said quietly, his tone no longer cautious but edged with something heavier. "Do you want this?" I turned toward him fully, no space left between us, and the way his eyes searched, mine told me he wasn't just talking about tonight, he was asking about us. Outside, someone laughed, the sound distant enough to remind us we still had time, but close enough to make every choice feel reckless. "I've wanted this longer than I've wanted to admit," I said, my voice low but firm. His smile was small, almost disbelieving, and before I could say more, he slid his hand to the back of my neck and pulled me into another kiss, this one deeper, unbothered by the risk of being overheard. The tent, the cold, the friends nearby, it all melted into the background until the only thing left was the heat between us. And then the fire popped outside, voices shifting closer again, and I realized we might not have the privacy we thought we did. The fire popped again outside, a sharp crack that made me aware of just how thin the tent walls really were, and how easily our friends could hear anything we didn't mean to share. But instead of pulling away, he pressed closer, his thigh sliding against mine under the shared sleeping bag, his hand still curved around the back of my neck as if to anchor me there. "You're warm," he murmured, his lips brushing mine as he spoke, and though it could have been about the cold night air, it felt more like an admission. I shifted slightly, enough to feel the length of his body against mine, and the sleeping bag's tight cocoon made every point of contact unavoidable. The brush of his knee, the steady weight of his chest, even the faint scratch of his stubble when his mouth found my jaw. It was all sharper because we couldn't move much, forced into a closeness that felt deliberate. A burst of laughter from outside drifted closer, someone dragging a chair across the dirt, and the sound made my pulse kick. Every touch became amplified by the knowledge that our friends were just meters away, sitting in the glow of the fire, unaware of what was building in here. Or maybe they'd suspect. The thought made my skin prickle. He slid his palm slowly down my side, fingers brushing over the thin fabric, his breathing deepening in a way that made my own chest feel too tight. "This isn't just the cold, is it?" he said, his voice low but with a smile I could hear. I answered by catching his wrist and guiding his hand back up to my chest, letting him feel how hard my heart was pounding. Outside, a log shifted in the fire pit, sending another spray of sparks into the air. The flicker of light caught through the tent wall, illuminating his eyes just enough for me to see the question in them, not if we should do this, but how far we'd let it go tonight. He leaned in, our foreheads touching, the warmth of his breath filling the narrow space between us. "I've wanted to know what this feels like for years," he whispered, and the way his thumb traced my collarbone left no doubt what this meant. I could have answered with words, but instead, I tilted my head and kissed him again, slower, deeper this time, letting the quiet night outside wrap around us like another layer of cover. Somewhere in the distance, someone stood from their chair, footsteps crunching in our direction. The sound was faint, but close enough to force us still, our lips hovering just a breath apart. The sleeping bag tangled around us like proof we were already past the point of pretending. The footsteps outside the tent slowed until they were directly beside us, the sound of boots pressing into the cool dirt so close I could almost feel the vibration through the ground. We stayed perfectly still, wrapped in the narrow sleeping bag, our breaths shallow and synced like we'd practiced this kind of hiding before. Through the thin wall of nylon, a shadow loomed, shifting slightly, and my stomach knotted at the thought that they might be able to hear the rush of blood in my ears. He didn't let go of me. If anything, his fingers pressed more firmly into my side, a silent message that said, "Don't move, don't breathe too loud." The fire outside popped and crackled, throwing faint flickers of orange light across the tent wall, which only made the figure outside stand out sharper. "You guys in there?" It was Tom's voice, low but unmistakably close, casual but edged with curiosity. We didn't answer. For a moment, the only sounds were the hiss of the fire and the faint shuffle of feet in the dirt. I felt the warmth of his chest against my back, the rise and fall of his breathing measured to match mine, both of us silently willing Tom to give up and walk away. After what felt like a full minute, Tom muttered something under his breath too low to catch, and the shadow shifted. The footsteps retreated slowly toward the fire, fading until they were swallowed by the general murmur of voices and the occasional ring of laughter. The tension in my body loosened, but the grip he had on me didn't. His lips brushed my ear as he exhaled, and the heat of it sent a shiver down my spine despite the closeness. "That was close," he murmured, and I could hear the smirk in his voice, not nervous, but energized. I turned toward him, the tight space forcing my leg to slide against his, our knees brushing until neither of us could pretend it was accidental. The sleeping bag pulled snug around us as we shifted, trapping the heat, trapping us. "You know," he said, his voice pitched low enough to stay just between us. "If we keep pretending this is just about staying warm, we're lying to ourselves." His eyes held mine in the dim light, steady and unblinking. And for a moment, the fire outside, the voices, the whole campsite, it all blurred into background noise. Then, without waiting for my answer, he leaned in and kissed me again. This time it was unhurried, deep, and certain, like he'd decided the risk was worth more than whatever came after. My hand found his jaw, feeling the rough edge of stubble under my fingertips, while his slid around my back, pulling me in until there was nothing but the press of his body against mine. The cold outside didn't matter anymore. The only thing I felt was him. The kiss deepened, and the tent, small, dark, and smelling faintly of pine and campfire, became its own world, sealed off from the laughter and conversation a few meters away. Outside, the fire popped, voices carried. Someone coughed, but all of it felt muted, as though our ears were tuned only to the sound of each other breathing. He shifted onto his side, the motion pulling the sleeping bag snug around us until our bodies were pressed flush. His thigh slid against mine, slow but unyielding, and his hand moved from my hip to my lower back, drawing small, deliberate circles with his thumb, like he was grounding himself as much as he was grounding me. The heat of him was immediate and constant, sinking through every thin layer between us, until the cold air beyond the tent seemed like another country entirely. "I don't want to pretend after this," he whispered, his voice low, steady, but tinged with something almost vulnerable. I eased back just enough to see him in the faint, shifting light from outside, the flicker of firelight catching the curve of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes impossible to misread. "I'm done pretending too," I told him, and the way the corner of his mouth lifted, slow, restrained, like he was afraid to let too much show, made my chest tighten. Footsteps crunched past outside, the rhythm of them slow enough to be noticed, but this time neither of us froze. Instead, he leaned in again, brushing his lips over mine in a way that was almost teasing, almost testing, before deepening the kiss until it was all I could taste. His hand traveled higher, tracing the ridge of my spine, pausing at my shoulder blade, as if memorizing the shape of me. "I've wanted this since the first trip we ever took," he murmured against my mouth, his fingers tightening at my back, holding me like he thought the night might try to take me away. My hand slid up to his jaw, feeling the rough edge of stubble beneath my fingertips, and I told him I'd been waiting for him to admit it, waiting longer than I'd ever admit to anyone else. The sleeping bag's restrictive hold made every movement intentional, the shift of his knee between mine, the slow press of his chest against mine as his breathing matched my own, the slight drag of his palm along my side, stopping just where heat pooled beneath the thin fabric. Outside, someone laughed loudly, the sound close enough to remind me we were far from alone, but instead of breaking the moment, it sharpened it, made every touch feel stolen, and therefore more precious. And in that cocoon of heat, with the weight of his arm around me and the quiet certainty in his eyes, we crossed the line we'd both been circling for years. There would be no stepping back. The sleeping bag held us together in a way that felt almost engineered for this. Not for sleep, not just for warmth, but for closing the last inches between us that had lingered for years. Outside, the fire had burned lower, the voices of our friends softer now, drifting into that loose, late-night rhythm where every sound felt far away. In here, I could hear the steady pull of his breath, the faint rustle of nylon when either of us moved, and the quiet, unshakable thud of his heartbeat against my chest. He tilted his head to look at me in the dim spill of firelight filtering through the tent walls. There was a calm in his eyes now, but not softness, it was focus, that quiet determination I'd only ever seen when he was about to do something that mattered. "You're warm now," he whispered, his lips close enough that I could feel the shape of the words against my skin. "Yeah," I said, smiling slightly, "but I think that has more to do with you than the bag." The sound that came from him then was low and rough, a quiet laugh that felt like it had been waiting to get out for years. He shifted, the sleeping bag tightening around us, his legs sliding more firmly between mine, his arm finding its way around my waist. The weight and heat of him weren't just comforting, they were anchoring, making me feel like I could stay right here until the sun came up. "We should probably sleep," he murmured, but the way his thumb traced lazy, careful lines against my side told me neither of us was going to. The air inside was warm, heavy with the faint scent of pine and the smokiness from the campfire still clinging to his shirt. I thought about how many nights we'd sat together in group settings, laughing and talking, pretending the pull wasn't there. Tonight, with only the thin barrier of a zipper between us and the rest of the camp, there was nothing left to pretend about. A sudden shuffle of footsteps passed just outside the tent, someone heading toward the fire pit. We both went still for half a breath, listening. Then, instead of pulling back, his hand slid up my back, slow and deliberate, fingers curling gently at my shoulder as if to pull me into the safest place he knew. "Next trip," he said softly. "We're not waiting until the last night." I let out a quiet laugh, partly because I believed him, and partly because I knew we'd both been thinking the same thing. When he kissed me again, it was different, slower, heavier, almost like he wanted to imprint it on my skin. His fingers tangled briefly in my hair before smoothing back down, resting against my neck in a hold that felt less like possession and more like protection. Outside, the fire cracked once before settling into a steady glow. The rest of the camp had gone still, the late-night quiet wrapping around us like another layer of the sleeping bag. Inside, we stayed awake, memorizing the warmth, the curve of each other's breath, and the quiet relief of finally being here. No more teasing distance, no more pretending. And as my eyes finally began to close, I realized there was no going back. Not now, not after this. Whatever came next, we'd stepped into it together. If you stayed with this story until the end, drop a comment saying, "That wasn't just about staying warm," so we know exactly who felt the heat, the risk, and the moment all the way through.